All right. Well, welcome everyone to the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. My name is Kenneth Hoffman. I'm the executive director. I'm filling in for Lizzie Meister, our wonderful public programs manager, who is operating the Zoom. So I'm here, she's doing the Zoom. We have a wonderful program tonight. We're very excited to have Jason Friedman with us, who I will be introducing in just a moment. For our folks online, if you have questions during the presentation, please use the chat. And after, we'll be able to read through some of those questions and Jason can answer them. For the in-person folks in the room, you'll be able to raise your hand and ask a question. And following the book talk, we will adjourn to the lobby where there's a small reception, and Jason will be available to sign books that you purchase from the museum store. So now comes the introduction. Jason K. Friedman was born and raised in Savannah, Georgia, and earned a BA from Yale and an MA from the Johns Hopkins Writing Seminars. His book of stories, Fire Year, won the Mary McCarthy Prize in Short Fiction and the Anne and Robert Cowan Writers Award. His work has also appeared in the New York Times, Moment, Tablet, the Gettysburg Review, Image, Fjord's Review, Cimarron Review, and the Decadent Review, and has been anthologized in Best American Gay Fiction, The Queer South, and the Cultural Studies Reader Goth. He also published two terrifying children's books, Phantom Trucker and Haunted Houses. He lives in San Francisco with his husband, filmmaker Jeffrey Friedman. Please help me welcome Jason K. Friedman. Somebody do the interview. It's on. Good.
Thank you, Ken. Hi, Don, for coming. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And thank you to the museum for hosting me. I'm gonna get my notes up. I first came to this museum last fall and I loved it. And I was especially delighted to find that a couple of things. In the gift shop, there's a picture, there's a little book about the Jews of Savannah. And my grandfather is on the cover. You can recognize him. He's the little guy with like a smirking, lopsided smile, just like mine. And the other thing that I was delighted to find here on the wall was an artifact from the very family that I write about in my book, Liberty Street. It was a recipe from Miriam Gratz Moses, a handwritten page from one of her recipe books. And I'm just going to advance this. We can take a look. This definitely worked when I practiced it. Oh, is it upside down? Or maybe we can just press it.
1 sec. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Keep talking.
I think it'd be great if we could have a visual, but I will happily talk. This is a recipe of hers, and it's a handwritten page. And at the bottom, looks like there's a recipe or the heading for a recipe for charoset. And at the top, there's a recipe for an almond cake, and in the middle is a recipe for a Pesach sponge cake. Shall I? There we go. Yeah. This is from the wall. This is a crop photo from the wall of this very museum. Here are the ingredients, in case you can't read it. Here are the ingredients for Miriam Gratz Moses's Pesach sponge cake. 11 eggs, leaving out 3 whites to a pound of sugar, 1/2 pound of flour, essence of lemon. The eggs to be beaten together to be perfectly light and the same consistence as when the flour is added, after which they may not be beaten. Drop them on paper with over them fine sugar. I think that's what it says. I do think she could have used an editor.
I think our country accent.
Yeah, I think a step was what it felt. I also want to know how hot my oven needs to be. And when I put all this in, how long I need to bake it. But other than these minor details, what is unusual or some would say downright wrong with this recipe for Pesach sponge cake? What strikes you as
Flour.
Flour, the fact that there's flour in it.
flour? Yes, a point that this very museum makes. Well, we don't have flour. You're not supposed to. You put flour in your. You're not supposed to have flour on Passover, except for flour in the form of matzahs that have been blessed by the rabbi, right? So the and part of the larger exhibit this is in is makes the point. This is sort of a mini tale of assimilation. The recipe is Pesach sponge cake. It's a Hebrew word, obviously trying to bake for a Jewish holiday that this family is celebrating, but yet it yields to modern times by incorporating flour. At the time that Miriam Gratz Moses wrote this recipe, 1828. She wasn't yet a Cohen. She hadn't gotten married to Solomon Cohen, who is another person who is a central character in my book. Nor was she a Southerner yet. She was living in Philadelphia. She was raised by her aunt Rebecca Gratz. That maybe a lot of you have heard of Rebecca Gratz. She was the most famous Jewish woman of the 19th century, and we're going to talk more about Rebecca Gratz. But when Miriam finally did marry Solomon Cohen and moved from Philadelphia to Georgetown and became Miriam Gratz Moses Cohen, and when she moved south, first to Georgetown, then to Savannah, that's when her aunt Rebecca Gratz, really started worrying about her, and not just whether she was putting flour in her Passover cake. We're going to talk about what was going on in Judaism in the South in the 19th century. That's something you guys could probably all tell me. But before we get there, I want to tell you a little bit about myself and the book. As Ken said, I grew up in Savannah. Have you guys been to Savannah? A lot of people have been to Savannah. Yeah, well, quick history about Savannah. It was founded in 1733 by James Edward Oglethorpe. And interestingly, it was really meant to be a utopian kind of communitarian experiment meant to foster cooperation among people. If you've been to Savannah, you see that it's organized around squares. Those weren't just meant to be pretty parks. They weren't really meant to be parks at all. But the layout was very tightly prescribed. They were on the east and west side of every square were what were called tithing lots. Those were meant to be public buildings like theaters or markets and churches. And the private lots were all exactly the same. Every one of the settlers in this new colony of Georgia had the exact same amount of land. Their garden was exactly the same size. There were limits to how much you could leave your kids. It was really designed as a place where people would be forced into, the physical layout would force people to work together, where people weren't going to get too rich or be too poor. Oglethorpe was trying to model the new colony after these kind of English agrarian ideals he had without the ills, real or imagined, of London at the time. And so to further those ideals, you might know that there were four, in addition to the things the interesting physical layout of the city, we're going to take a look at that. He also banned four things. He banned, he and also the trustees behind the new colony of Georgia. So they banned slaves. I believe that Oglethorpe and the trustees found slavery repugnant, but Oglethorpe also was a stockholder in various imperialist corporations that did rely on slave labor and slave trading. I think the real reason for banning slaves and slavery was legal just across the river in South Carolina was because he didn't want the huge plantations that were already there in South Carolina to be present in Georgia as well. It just violated this ideal that everybody was going to work their own land. rum was banished from this colony, didn't want people to be drinkers. Catholics also banned from the new colony of Georgia. Why Catholics? Because Georgia was meant to be a buffer colony between the Catholics in Spain and the more established English colonies starting from South Carolina going up the eastern seaboard. And he felt that if there were Catholics in this new country, they would ally themselves with the Catholics in Spain. So no Catholics, and finally no lawyers. No lawyers. Lawyers were banned. He wanted the settlers to be able to work out their disputes for themselves without any kind of mediators like that. Savannah in 17. Here's a picture of Savannah in 1734. You can see the squares. Again, it looks very basic, like there's squares, there's two, but again, just the way the streets, just the way the lots on each side were organized. It was all tightly prescribed. The city's on the left. And so I think Oglethorpe had his tent right there on the left side. This would be 1734. 1734, for our purposes, was a big year because it was the year that the Jews arrived in Savannah. Yes, the Jews arrived in Savannah on the second boat, and it was a boat coming from London. I look at this picture and I think that if you leave London to move to this place, you must really want to change your life. I mean, really. The boat was sponsored by Bemis Marks, which was the great Sephardic synagogue in London. And Bemis Marks had already contributed money to this new colony of Georgia. And I think the elders of the synagogue are surprised to find out that that did not entitle them to sponsor a group of people who wanted to move to the New World or needed to move to the New World for the better life they were seeking. They were surprised that didn't entitle them to actually send their congregants there, but they went ahead and did it anyway. Sent a boat in 1734 to Georgia. When the trustees found out that Jews had settled in the new colony in Savannah, they panicked and wrote a letter to James Oglethorpe, the founder. This letter essentially said, the Jews have arrived. It's going to ruin the neighborhood. I wish that were a joke, but that's basically what they said. They said that they would have a hard time attracting colonists to Georgia if there were Jews there. So it was up to Oglethorpe, the founder, to decide what to do about the Jews. He consulted the charter. You might remember the things that were not allowed in, and the groups of people who were not allowed in the new colony. Jews were not on the list. Maybe that was just an oversight, but anyway, Jews were not on the list of banned groups. And also there, one of the people on the second boat was a doctor named Samuel Nunez. These were Portuguese Jews who were fleeing the Portuguese Inquisition by way of London. Nunez, his daughter later wrote, Nunez was a Marana, kind of secret Jew. And when his daughter later wrote that he was the personal doctor to the Grand Inquisitor of Portugal. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, think of that. There was a yellow fever epidemic in Savannah at the time, and Nunez treated the colonists, and the epidemic eventually waned. And so Oglethorpe said, okay, the Jews are staying. And so the Jews have been there ever since. My experience of Savannah was not a place with much anti-Semitism at all, but still it was a tiny town. I got out of there as soon as I could and went north to college. But a few years ago, my attitude toward my hometown started to change. You know, like you lose the grievances of the past and grow up. And I also think that my hometown was growing up too, was becoming a more interesting city to me, a more tolerant kind of a place. So and my parents were growing older, and so I wanted to have a foothold there. So my husband and I started to look for places. My husband is Jeffrey Friedman, and neither of us changed our names. I just wanted to point that out. One of the listings that we saw was something called the Solomon Cohen house. Having grown up in Savannah, I knew that the great houses of Savannah, I don't know if it's the same in New Orleans, but the great houses of Savannah had names like Owens Thomas or Green Meldrum or Davenport. Solomon Cohen, not so much. I figured it was just a real estate thing, calling it a Solomon Cohen house. I did get a kick out of the house that was a selling point to name this house after a Jew. But anyway, we bought the place. It was an 1875 townhouse downtown, not because we thought it was more historic than anything else in the historic district, but just because it was a beautiful place. This is the outside. We recently had it cleaned. It had all this ancient grime on the front that I thought looked good, but some of the other people in the houses are more like fixer-upper types, so we had it cleaned. So we bought the place. After buying it, I opened a drawer in the kitchen, and there was a fact sheet about the house. I had no idea how that fact sheet got in the drawer, but it said some basic things about the house and about Solomon Cohen, and I started actually researching this. Interestingly, when we got our place in San Francisco where we live, also after moving in, I opened the dishwasher for the first time, and it was full of dishes. They were all mildewy, but we just ran the dishwasher. There was some good stuff. So really, there are all sorts of things you can find in a house. Nobody thinks to actually open drawers or open dishwashers. But so I started to research these folks. The Cohens actually came to Savannah in 1750 from London. The first Cohen was named Moses Cohen, again, a Sephardic Jew. Moses was in Charleston. He was a founder of the temple of the synagogue Beit Elohim. He was an unpaid rabbi. He was an unpaid physician. He was also a shopkeeper. And then 100 years later, his grandson Solomon Cohen ended up a banker, a lawyer, district attorney. He was a politician. He was a postmaster. He was a real estate developer. He was a synagogue president. In Yiddish, you would call him a macher, right? He was a boss. He was an important person, and one of the sort of the biggest shots of mid-19th century Savannah. This is a family picture. You can see it's a very kind of prosperous looking family. Solomon Cohen is over there. You can see he's the dad. This is Miriam, his wife. Brett's, their son, is on the left side. And you can see he's holding I didn't notice this for a long time, he's holding a giant book. And then that's Belle, one daughter, and then you get the younger daughter, Miriam or Mamie. Solomon was a very stern guy, very tough as a lawyer and a politician. He was very much an establishment figure and quite scornful to anybody who considered an opponent in any way. He didn't seem like an especially likable person to me for all of his accomplishments. And then I discovered his son, Gratz. Gratz's diary was in the Historical Society in Savannah. Gratz was a different kind of person than his father. He was very sensitive, bookish. He wrote romantic poetry. He ended up, obviously he's a kid here, he ended up being the first Jewish student at the University of Virginia. He was disabled in some way. He had some problem with his feet that troubled him. He had a hard time standing for long periods of time, and really tormented him about just how manly he really could ever be. And then his wife Miriam was an extremely impressive person in her own right. That recipe I shared at the start of this talk was from a collection of recipes in the Southern Historical Collection in Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina, where I did a lot of research. But there are also her poetry is there. She wrote poetry and collected them in manuscripts. There are a lot of letters there. She was fluent in French and knew Hebrew. I'm giving you these little thumbnail sketches of these people because I want you to know kind of what really attracted me to these people to begin with. There are a lot of interesting things going on historically at the time, but I only really got interested in these folks when I started really kind of thinking of them as kind of characters in a family tragedy. Gratz would end up getting killed at 20 on a battlefield in North Carolina. I felt close to these people in the sense that, their ghosts still kind of haunted the block I lived on. Solomon Cohen and his family lived in a big house on the corner, but he developed the entire row on that block. So I guess that's why they called my house the Solomon Cohen house. So I felt in a way connected with these people, but I also felt quite that they were kind of emissaries from a very distant past, a very strange period of time in which people owned slaves. That might have been one of the strangest aspects of this time for me. So I think it was this combination of being connected to these people and also finding them very strange that made me want to kind of understand how they lived and write this book. I tell this story in first person. It's a little bit of my quest to find these people. I'm kind of a guide through this strange world. I think that the book actually did need a guide. I wanted to get all the details straight about kind of what it was like to be Jewish in the 19th century at the time. Though for most Jews, I think this is true outside of the South, I try to get into all the details about, the period and make sure that I'm getting them right. And almost invariably, they say to me, I didn't know there were Jews in the South, right? So I think most people really are starting from scratch. Telling the story myself allows me to kind of speculate about what might really have happened when the historical record is silent, but it also allows me to ask a lot of the questions that interested me about this period. And I think some of these questions would have sounded very naive at the time, might even still sound naive today. But I ask the questions so that you can get the answers. And so some of the questions I had was, what was it like to be Jewish in the South in the 19th century? I also wanted to know why would a young man go to war, and why did Jews specifically fight for the Confederacy? I really wanted to know how Jews could own slaves, considering that a liberation story, which we just read on Passover, is central to the Jewish religion. That was something that I found really problematic and interesting. And finally, I want to explore how should we remember a history that's at least partly uncomfortable to us today, but continues to mark American life, and that actually still deserves to be told, I think, and understood. Those are the things I wanted to understand, but in the context of really just telling a story of this family. I want to get back now to Savannah in the 1850s. There was a period of depression in Savannah, the 1830s and the 1840s. The price of cotton was depressed. Now in the mid 50s, this is a boom town. The railroad has just completed this last leg, which allows cotton to be transported from the interior of the state down to Savannah on the river. It's a port. There's a building frenzy, and the city is pushing south away from the river. We need more housing. The city needs more housing for people who work on the docks and who work in the processing of cotton and other goods that are shipped out of the port, and also the supplies and also luxury goods that are now coming into the port. Places for merchants to live, stores are opening up. Hotels are going up. The city is really expanding. I think you remember that 1734 image of Savannah, that same pattern which of 6 squares, which Oglethorpe never really thought was going to be repeated, even though it looked as though you could just repeat it to infinity. Suddenly more and more squares are being built, and that same pattern is being repeated again and again. And Solomon Cohen has done more than his share to kind of create this boom town with all the hats he wore. So this is what Savannah looks like in 1855. It's the opposite kind of view where we're looking toward the river instead of away from it. Here's one of the squares in the foreground. It's a bustling city, even though most accounts that I've read of visitors to the city at this period remarked on how rural it did feel. Quite leafy, but I think you can see how this is definitely no longer this sort of rural agrarian ideal that Oglethorpe wanted to be, of like a kind of yeoman farmers, each farming their own little plot of land. This is a real city now. You know, for better and for worse. You remember the four things that were banned in the original colony of Georgia. Well, slave trading is a big business. Solomon Cohen, Esquire, owns 23 people. So now we have slavery and we have lawyers as well. Rum, as I understand from my research, there were more liquor stores and bars in mid-19th century Savannah than there are today. And for anybody who's been to Savannah, that is really saying something. And Catholics too. We have Irish dock workers, Irish servants, Irish merchants. So it's no longer the city that Oglethorpe really imagine. It's a bustling boomtown city. This is where Solomon Cohen's family lived at the time. It's right on the corner of the block where we live. Let's get back to Miriam.
Is that the family?
Yeah, these are actually the younger daughter, Mamie. This was actually her family, and her husband. This was their city house, and and they also lived in a plantation, former rice plantation. So yeah, that's not Solomon and Miriam. But I want to get back to Miriam. I think I talked a bit about Solomon. A big shot. He had a hand in everything in Savannah, all these institutions. So Miriam, when she and Solomon moved to Savannah in 1838 from Georgetown, South Carolina, the price of cotton was down. The city was broke. So was the synagogue in Israel. They didn't have enough money to even hire a rabbi or a chazan, which is what the leader is known as in the Sephardic service. Miriam and a bunch of other synagogue ladies decided to raise money to hire a rabbi. And they had a fair that lasted 3 days, beginning on St. Patrick's Day of 1843. And it worked. After a few years, with the money that they had raised, Solomon invested in the railroad. Boone Town was on its way, and they were able to actually hire the synagogue's first chazan. Miriam was also the secretary of the female orphan asylum. She opened a branch in Savannah of Hebrew Sunday School. Her aunt, Rebecca Gratz, she was actually the first person to dream up Hebrew Sunday School. It doesn't even seem like the kind of thing that needs to be dreamt up, but she did. And so Miriam was also an educator. Miriam's mother died when she was young. It was really Rebecca who raised her. And so they write a lot. In the early 40s, years go by where they don't even see each other. At one point, Miriam wishes for a magic carpet to be with her family up north in Philadelphia. Solomon's a very busy man, so I think Miriam is lonely a lot of the time. She wishes for a magic carpet. The more that I read these letters, it seems like the letters themselves were a sort of magic carpet that allowed Miriam and Rebecca to actually be together. But Rebecca is worried. As I said, she really started to worry about Miriam more than just about what's in her Passover cake. I had sort of made reference at the beginning of this talk to what's going on in Judaism in the South in the 19th century, the mid-19th century. Well, no, do you know what I'm talking about? The development in Judaism. So it's a reform Judaism. Charleston's Beit Elohim, where the kind of the patriarch of his family was the first rabbi. That's where the American Reform movement originated in 1824. It was a strict Orthodox Sephardic synagogue, but times have changed. Reform Judaism reimagines Jewish rituals and practices for modern times. And the Savannah synagogue, Mikveh Israel, does not become reformed till much later, but still the winds of change are blowing through the South. Maybe you all could tell me when Reform Judaism came to New Orleans, but the winds of change are blowing through the South, and this worries Rebecca. Rebecca is a very kind of establishment figure. Let me show you what Rebecca looked like. Very establishment figure, even though she wasn't quite as she always clung to this idea of herself as a very ladylike person. But everything she was doing in terms of founding and running these orphanages and homes, institutions for orphans and widows, educational institutions. She minimized her contributions, but she was the mastermind behind them all. But she was worried that with Miriam in the South, that she would abandon orthodoxy and that she would become a reformed Jew. Rebecca blames the German reformers and grouses. There seems to be no end to their innovations and enlightenment. And she did not mean this in a good way. But at any rate, Miriam's sister Sarah goes to visit Miriam, and she reports back that Miriam and Solomon keep a traditional home and not to worry. But Miriam was changing. She was becoming a Southerner with all that entailed. Rebecca Gratz was against slavery. But she also had a problem with abolitionists. This is not as unusual a combination as it sounds for many Jews at the time. Rebecca wrote in letters that I read first that she felt abolitionists were actually counterproductive in improving the life of enslaved Black people. I think Rebecca felt that abolitionists were rabble rousers in a way. Philadelphia at the time was kind of a hubbub of activity for great progressive movements, abolitionism, feminism, workers' rights, and Rebecca was attended lectures where she was exposed to all of these currents. At one point, she saw a lecture by Lucretia Mott, very famous abolitionist of the day, and she wrote to Miriam in a very kind of arch way. I saw this little woman, and she was just very kind of condescending. I feel that she felt that these abolitionists, especially the women, were just not ladylike. Obviously, this being a proper a lady and part of the establishment was something that Rebecca prized. I think there was also another reason why Rebecca Gratz was suspicious of abolitionists. And I think it was also the reason that she founded Hebrew Sunday School. In the 19th century, many Christians never met a Jew that they didn't want to convert, right? That was a big mission in the 19th century, to convert Jews. And a lot of abolitionist societies were deeply connected to the church. So for her, this was not a contradiction to be opposed to slavery, but also to be somewhat suspicious of abolitionists. Meanwhile, down in Savannah, Solomon Cohen was one of the institution of slavery, was one of the institution of slavery's biggest defenders, both as a lawyer and as a politician. The little museum in Mikveh Israel Synagogue in Savannah, to their credit, lists all the many hats he wore, but also lists him as, to their credit, as a defender of slavery. And so then we have Miriam. She had come to the South as a stranger in a strange land. Legal slavery actually persisted in Pennsylvania until 1847. It was abolished before Miriam was born, but slaves were kind of grandfathered in. So the presence of slaves in the South could not have been that strange to Miriam. But I think the fact that she was living in a place where the whole economy was based on slave labor must have been very strange. Georgetown, South Carolina, a cute little tourist town now, but it was the center of a swampy realm that produced most of the nation's rice. It was a top port for rice exports. And then in Savannah, it's a top port for cotton exports. Miriam is married to a slave owner. 8 slaves live in her home. Her husband is a big defender of slavery. I should note that Jews weren't the mass slave owners and enslavers that non-Jewish plantation owners were, but urban slavery is definitely a fascinating phenomenon that I learned a lot about through this book. Through another scholar, I'm not really a scholar, but a scholar who wrote his dissertation on Savannah Jews, really did point out that Jews owned slaves proportionally to their income, just as non-Jews did. So Solomon had staked out his position, and in the lead up to war, it was getting kind of harder and harder to be a neutral party. So it's 1862. I'm just going to read a quote here. It's 1862. The nation is at war with itself. The Union is falling apart, has fallen apart, and it's the women who are trying to keep it together. If you read letters at the time, women overwhelmingly in their letters tried to stick to non-political subjects and tried to confine themselves to domestic matters to try to ensure family harmony, but the world inevitably kept creeping in. Miriam and Rebecca did talk about how so-and-so was doing, who died, who's sick, who's recovering, what they're sewing. But these were not the kind of women who could really limit themselves to those matters. So even though Miriam never takes a stand on slavery, even when Rebecca seems to provoke her into doing so, it was part of the world around her and part of her own household. So Miriam writes this to Rebecca in 1862. The South considers herself the aggrieved, not for the last year, but for a series of years, and it cost her as bitter a pang to dissolve her union with the States as it can the North now. But she considered it the only remedy and wished to do so peaceably. The North denies her that right and says that union must be preserved. How can that which is severed be made whole again? God knows how dearly I love both North and South, and how many tears this warring of my countrymen has caused me, and how fervently do I pray that bloodshed may be averted, for the voice of a brother's blood will cry from the ground in either case. Notice how Miriam presents herself less as a gung-ho rebel and kind of as a body caught between opposing forces. Rebecca begs her not to let her son Gratz go to certain death on the battlefield. He sits out most of the war in Virginia, and I spend a lot of time imagining what it must have felt like for him to be one of the only men apparently in one piece around. He found it quite humiliating. But he felt he really couldn't serve until Sherman, in his famous March to the Sea from Atlanta to Savannah, was making his way to Savannah, and Gratz went off to war and almost immediately got himself killed. After he died, I want you to hear how Miriam sounded in a letter she wrote to Rebecca. You heard what she sounded like to Rebecca in 1862. Here's how she sounded after Gratz was killed. I love the South, the home of my adoption, more tenderly in its hour of humiliation than in its days of prosperity and happiness. And then it is the grave of my precious one, exclamation point, and must ever be held sacred for the sacrifice laid on its altar, exclamation point. And this is how she sounded consistently after Gratz's death. Her letters were full of exclamation points. I guess people didn't smile so much in pictures, but this is Miriam on the right side, 20 years after Gratz died, 10 years after her husband died. She never got over losing Gratz or forgave the North. Closure is really not a thing for Miriam Cohen. And interestingly, in her brokenness, she comes to fully identify with the vanquished South. This is just a bit of I wanted to give you a taste of this kind of personal family tragedy, which to me stands for the larger tragedy of the Civil War, and made me kind of interested in telling these folk stories. So thank you very much. And there's lots more to talk about, but I really wanted to allow time for questions.
Well, let's start by seeing if there's anyone in the audience here that has any questions for you.
Oh, I would know.
Okay, well, here we go. Here's our first question.
Okay. What about, let me see, I know you talked about Shabbat,
What about the Ashkenazi? When do they ever show up in Savannah? And
Yeah, there were like, definitely later waves. There was a letter, Miriam wrote a letter to Rebecca in the, I think either late 40s or early 50s, when she talks about I think it was a picnic the kids went on. I think it was like maybe a pre-Passover picnic, something like that. And the kids are singing German songs and reading a German poem. And to me, this reflects the changes in the demographics of Savannah. So late 40s, early 50s, started having more migration from the German states. And also more migration to Savannah from other parts of the South. You know, all sorts of people, not just Jews, were coming to Savannah because it was a boom town. You could make a living there. And then, of course, like later decades, like in the 80s, when you see 1880s, because of pogroms in Eastern Europe, you see more migration from Eastern European Jews. I don't know if it was the same pattern here. It probably was. Yeah, it's very interesting. And of course, every established group, you know, had its like concerns and worries and embarrassments about the group the less assimilated group that's coming. So, but we all know that story. So,
I have a question. Tell us, I know that the Jewish community of Savannah is very proud of the fact that they were, one of the earliest congregations set up in the colonies.
yeah.
Tell us about the Jewish congregation and Jewish community in Savannah today. Is there anything you can share with us?
Yeah, I mean, there's still just as when I was growing up, there's an Orthodox synagogue and a Reform, and there's a Reform temple and a conservative synagogue, which I grew up in. There's a Chabad there now. That seems to be the new development in Savannah Jews. It's a sort of vibrant Jewish community. It always surprises me when people are surprised when they're Jews in the South, because I went to a Hebrew day school. Everybody I knew basically was Jewish until I changed schools in middle school. I remember on our 8th grade trip, we went to New York and took the train from Savannah up to New York. I had this very cinematic memory. I don't know how true it was, but I definitely had this memory of going up the steps. This was, you could probably still smoke back then, so maybe this was true, but I remember going up the steps. I remember smoke clearing, and I saw these black-hatted, black-coated Hasidim, and I remember thinking, oh, they're Jews? They're Jews in New York. Anyway, it's good to learn about other people.
There's a question from online. Someone is asking for you to talk a little bit about where you did your research. Some of the different places that you found some of the history of the house and the family.
Yeah, a lot of the research I could do close to home at the Georgia Historical Society in Savannah. The rabbi of the temple wrote a big book that was a history of the temple, and the history of the temple is basically the history of the Jews in Savannah until the second half of the 19th century. I went to Virginia and went inside of a dorm room to see what that was like, and they have some artifacts there. I also traced Gratz Cohen. I traced his steps on it was called the Carolinas campaign, for the last phase of the war in 1865 from January to April. So I went to the various places where he fought and to various little battlefields. And there's also a great archive in Atlanta. So I did a lot of research with that there. And there's also an archive in this plantation I mentioned about 90 miles south of Savannah. So I did a lot of research. I was definitely quite a novice when I started out. I dutifully went to a Chapel Hill to look at these letters, and of course, I show up and the historian there informs me that they're all digitized. Anyway, but it's kind of great to be able to hold the letters in your hand, you know, and look at the paper. That's also interesting because, you know, especially when Gratz was on the path of war, paper was scarce. And also looking at what he used to write, and they would also write in the back of the paper and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes it was illegible because the ink bled through. That was also interesting to see. So,
Do you know, are there any descendants still alive? Is there any descendants that are still alive? Are you able to trace that family tree?
yeah, not, let's see, I have not heard this, but the younger daughter, Mamie, let me just check if that's true. No, it was Belle, who's pictured right here. This was her second husband, but with her first husband, her daughter Fanny married a man named John Hunter. Hunter is a very big name in Savannah because it's named after this World War I, and then he went back from war in World War II, flying ace. A kind of a dashing bachelor type named he had a monk hunter. The big Air Force base there, and the name Hunter still exists in Savannah today. There aren't any Cohens who are related to this family, but a lot of the sort of the names that they name things like streets after are named after this family. And I know that the Hunters still know that they have a connection to this family. Gratz got killed, but the two daughters both married non-Jews, sort of society types, which was interesting because Solomon Cohen, a very strict by the book type who really resisted Reform Judaism. But he finally yielded. He was the synagogue president, so the congregants wanted. He was extremely opposed to intermarriage. But in a way, when you have a family that sort of participated, especially in a small southern town, in sort of all of these institutions, and this was sort of the inevitable kind of next step in that kind of assimilation. So, yeah.
I'm curious in what ways your own family's history there parallels this family. Are they deeply rooted for many generations, or did you guys come more recently?
Yeah, my family came in the 1890s, so definitely no enslavers to the family tree. You know, my family related to this. This book is sort of it's in a way it's a story about fathers and sons. Gratz was a very different kind of son than his father was, and this is sort of bookended with my relationship with my own father. He was also a very very conservative person who, in a way, I think partially for comic effect, but also partially seriously, talked a lot about the Old South. It's sort of like it was never quite clear what he was talking about, and I just thought he was quite deluded. But I couldn't imagine that it was really good for Jews in the Old South. That's part of what I really wanted to know, and actually Jews really were. It seems quite accepted in the Old South, largely because they lived like their neighbors. They owned slaves, for example, and just kind of lived like their neighbors. They were, perhaps for the first time in history, white. They weren't just Jews, but were part of the kind of larger kind of dominant group. Yeah, I think my family was not directly related to this, but it was definitely an interesting kind of dialogue with my father about kind of what it really was like about for Jews in the Old South.
All right, we have another question from all the line. This may be our last question, but you described Gratz as a boy who loved boys during the when it was the Civil War. Gratz was gay. Is that something that you are?
Yeah. I do want to talk about that.
Yeah, let's talk about
I don't like to make claims for maybe kind of modern terms like gay. Though I do think of Gratz kind of queer in a kind of very broad sense in different ways. His masculinity was kind of a problem for his family from the time he was 3. Miriam wrote this panicked letter to Rebecca. Rebecca never had kids of her own, but she taught and supervised the education for innumerable children, and including orphans in her various institutions. She was an educator and a pedagogue, and had very definite ideas of how children should be raised. Naturally, Miriam writes Rebecca whenever she has questions about how to raise Gratz. Apparently, Gratz was inconsolable. He cried when he was 3 at the death of a bird. Very moved and touched by this. Rebecca writes back. Her letters are wonderful. She really does sound like a pedagogue. And she said, "There's nothing wrong with crying at the death. A child who cries at the death of a bird will be kinder to people and to animals when properly regulated. He will know to coax out this gentleness." She encouraged his kindness and gentleness. She was also opposed to the fact that Miriam Solomon took Gratz out of his little dress when he was also around that age. Apparently, Victorian kids, boys and girls, wore these little dresses, and Rebecca didn't like that. She felt that when you take a little boy out of his dress, he becomes a man too soon. This seemed to be exactly what Solomon, at least, was aiming for. When Gratz was 6 years old, Gratz wrote a letter to Rebecca talking about how proud he was of this tough little kid who liked to take all these walks around Boomtown, Savannah. And he said that he would rather love Solomon said he would rather love his son's memory than that he had one drop of coward blood. It's a very chilling thing to say. And I'm sorry to say that Solomon actually kind of got what he sort of thought that he wanted. It turned out not to be what he wanted at all. His son died, basically ruined his life. Gratz's masculinity is also a concern to himself. He's in college, and he's much more connected to his roommates than he is to these sort of pretty young belles who every professor and military man, they were constantly introducing him to their daughters. He was one of the only men around. He was a very good looking young man, smart, polite, educated, all of that stuff. He felt he was always proud of the fact that he could always escape their entanglements. And really, he was much closer to the few men who were around. One of the interesting things about this, and weirdest thing, was he wrote this sort of passionate poetry and diary entries about his enslaved valet, Louis. The things he said make us cringe today, his little pet names for him. But even though Gratz was fully of his time and felt that nature had ordained that white people be superior to Black people, the way he wrote about Louis sort of gave away a kind of a different kind of relationship. He wrote about Louis as his second self, as his counterpart, as his other self, as his Sancho Panza, all of these things that are sort of like, it's sort of in a way kind of his double, his second self, things that kind of made him seem like kind of a self or an equal, or even a superior. He called him, again, I've already issued a cringe warning. He called him his ebony idol. An idol is an image of a god. He compared Louis to a tree, the tree of heaven. I looked this up. This is an invasive tree that its roots can kind of break through masonry, brick walls. He compared it to this tree that as if his roots had pierced every aspect of his soul. And so this was strange to me and very interesting. So I felt, I'm not going to say gay, but I felt that he was clearly had very passionate relationships with men in his life. With his enslaved valet, he was clearly deluding himself, because the enslaved valet, at the first chance he got in the confusion of war, escaped and emancipated himself. And Gratz was very tortured about how he felt about his mates at school, and in fact wrote diary entries saying that he hopes that they never feel the way he does and can remain pure. Gratz always wanted to remain pure, whatever that meant, and in fact wrote that he felt that the greatest accomplishment that a man could achieve was self-conquest. For Gratz, really the true enemy was himself, and I think that had a lot to do with why he ended up going to war on what was clearly everybody knew was a kind of a suicide mission. So yeah, that's another way in which I kind of really was felt connected and kind of fascinated by Gratz Cohen. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much,
Thank you.
Jason. For the folks online, we're gonna be ending. For the folks sitting here, y'all can stay for a moment. We want to thank Jason Friedman for sharing his time and
Thank you.
expertise with us.
Good.
For if you're online, you can purchase the book Liberty Street from our online store. And to keep up to date with the museum, if you don't already get the Southern Schmooze newsletter, you could sign up for it at msje.org/contact. And if you want to get our other newsletter, our membership newsletter, the Kibitz and Grits, then you can join by going to msje.org/membership. We'll be putting a recording of this program on our YouTube channel within a week or so. And thank you so much for joining us. All right.
Thank you.